It's supposed to be the off season. It's supposed to be the time where Damichael Cole can finally get some rest, where I can do my other 7 jobs that I have in peace and not have to worry about Dillon Brooks for 1 second. Just 1 second, Shams. Why can't you give me that? Just for one time, I need to sleep. I need to rest. Why can't I not talk about Dillon Brooks for one day? We're doing this next on Locked On Grizzlies. Lock in, please.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Breathe, Joe. Breathe.
I'm
breathe.
doing my breathing exercises.
Calm down.
I'm doing my breathing
calm down.
exercises. I've calmed down during the intro. I'm sorry for that. You guys know at this point I lose it sometimes. I'm back. I'm good. I'm better now. Welcome to Locked On Grizzlies. This is a Wednesday edition where we were supposed to just be talking about injuries, but obviously Dillon Brooks and Shams of The Athletic had other thoughts, and we'll get into those thoughts here momentarily, not just from myself, of course, but from my wonderful co-host, Damichael Cole there of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. He's the Grizzlies beat writer. I'm a Grizzlies columnist for Bluff City Media. I was going to talk about a path to the 2024 NBA Finals in that piece. Throw that out the window. Thanks a lot, Dillon Brooks. Breathing exercise. Woosah. Calm down. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by eBay Motors. A championship team is about each player being a perfect fit. Same with your vehicle. So for parts that fit, head to eBay Motors and look for the green check. Stay in the game with eBay Guaranteed Fit. ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit. Only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies, like every episode of Locked On Grizzlies, is brought to you as a proud member of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can also check us out on YouTube. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe. Tuesday was another strong day for us over on YouTube, and it is much appreciated. Let's keep that energy going. Let's keep folks around. Hopefully I didn't scare you off with my freak out there at the start of the show. Damichael Cole, we're going to dive right in if that's okay with you, because you had a little bit of a viral piece over at the Commercial Appeal. Good for you there, buddy, on social media, talking about this Dillon Brooks craziness. This kind of came out of left field. It smells, and I don't have any inside information. You're not divulging any inside information here. It smells like something an agent would do. But as we were talking a little bit before the show, Damichael, this is kind of, and you said it, this is kind of a lose-lose situation. The Grizzlies lose some leverage in a sign and trade. And if the Grizzlies have just unequivocally said they're not bringing him back, why in the world would an NBA team say, you know what? 17 mil for Dillon Brooks when his previous team wants nothing to do with him? Sign me up.
Yeah. Joe, you mentioned something earlier. You said I wasn't giving off any inside information, but you're not going to remember this maybe. But in yesterday's show, I kind of hinted. I said I have a Dillon Brooks piece coming.
That's true.
On tomorrow, I was throwing the alley-oop up there, and the story was pretty much already done. When the news dropped. At the end of the day, what my story said was Dillon Brooks wants a role that the Memphis Grizzlies cannot offer.
You did say that. You said that on the Monday episode, or Tuesday episode, excuse me. You sure did.
And that's kind of where it's the truth. Dillon Brooks basically has said things like 3-and-D. He first threw that out there to me, I think, in March. I think we were in Atlanta. I mentioned that already.
You did,
we were in
yes,
Atlanta,
sir.
And he didn't seem thrilled about it. I didn't try to make too much of it because there was so much else going on with the team.
Right.
I personally wasn't about to throw out there this whole, by the way, Dillon Brooks also isn't happy that he's a 3-and-D guy right now. But and quite frankly, he was working through it. I want to emphasize, I don't think this guy is not a team type player because it comes off as, he wants to be that guy. But in reality, I feel like just from the conversations I had with him, it's more of he wants to be playing to his strengths. From what I gathered, he was saying, hey, look, they want me to be this guy who plays defense and just sits around, takes spot up 3-pointers. He said, I got way more to my game than that. People probably were thinking, you're not better than that because you're struggling in that role. Where he probably was saying is, if you look, again, you've been covering Dillon since he first broke into the league. Dillon's strength has always been in the mid-range, dribbling the ball, getting to his spots. And again,
similar to Zaire Williams.
Similar to Zaire Williams from that way. And he's not the most efficient guy still, even in those areas, but he's better in those areas than he is at the three-point line. We can all agree on that. Absolutely. So I think it's basically the perspective of, why do you want me to shoot spot-up three-pointers when that's not the strength of my game? And again, it's the Zaire Williams school that we've kind of just touched on all season long, as it alludes to him being a strong mid-range guy, and the Grizzlies saying, hey, but we want you to be the three who shoots a lot of three-pointers. Well, Dillon Brooks has more on his resume than Zaire Williams, so he can straight up say, like, hey, I got more to my game there, even though people react how they did. And then there was another part of that, too, that I touched on. Dillon Brooks felt like more plays should have been drawn up for him. Dillon Brooks got to the point, as we said, he was a spot-up shooter. In that playoff series, we saw Desmond Bane, Luke Kennard, John Morant, all those guys would get things drawn up for them. But rarely ever was it Dillon Brooks. Dillon Brooks basically was the guy who was told to, be in the corner, set screens, which was new, but they had him operating more as a screen setter, and basically, play off of those guys, play make a little bit more. He tried. He definitely was setting screens more. He definitely had good moments of playmaking in that series against the Lakers. But overall, it was a situation that had reached its climax. Dillon Brooks operates better with the ball in his hands, and on a team that has John Morant, who likes the ball in his hands, Desmond Bane, who can operate without it, but he's really good with it in his hands. And then Jaren Jackson Jr., who is best with the ball in his hands. On a team like that, it's just not enough of the ball to go around to get Dillon Brooks those touches that he likes, and that's why he can't be back in Memphis.
It gives off Rudy Gay vibes at this point, and I say this as somebody that loved Rudy Gay. The idea of Dillon Brooks wanting to be
that's a great
player that he can't be in the current state of play. Like Rudy Gay and Zach Randolph, and people will disagree with me that have been following the team for a long time. Rudy Gay and Zach Randolph couldn't exist together, at least not being the best versions of one another. There's a reason why Super Zebo went off in that playoff series, right? Because somebody wasn't there. And I think that that's an important piece of context in Grizzlies history to remember. Dillon Brooks has been asked, I think we talked a little bit about this.
Yeah, you did. Great point.
He's been asked to do so much. He started over 300 games as a member of the Memphis Grizzlies. Imagine being Dillon Brooks. His confidence has brought him to this place. He's not an elite athlete. He has a lot of similarities to Zebo in terms of the way that he has come up, non-traditional player, the tenacity, the energy. He's got a lot in common with those grit and grind guys that everybody loves to talk about. The difference is Tony Allen didn't shoot as much as Dillon Brooks does. And Dillon sees himself as something that he was when he came into the league. From the very first moment he was a member of the Memphis Grizzlies, he was asked to be exactly what you just outlined. And now they don't need him to do that anymore. He doesn't want to change his role, at least not in Memphis. If he gets traded in a sign and trade, which we'll talk more about that another show, but that's more difficult now. If that does still happen, which I wrote about over at Bluff City Media, the Portland Trailblazers make a heck of a lot of sense, especially if they tank a little bit. The Toronto Raptors make a heck of a lot of sense, especially if they tank a little bit. Yeah. His confidence, and we talked about this with the Jonas Valanciunas comparison, he was the training wheels. He was the one that put them in a position to feel good about themselves, to show some swagger, to be confident. It got out of control for reasons that include Dillon Brooks, but are not limited to Dillon Brooks. Mm-hmm. And now they are trying to go away from that. And my biggest thing coming out of this, I think we're on the same page, it's time for it to end. I have been following this team too long to say that Dillon Brooks was bad for the Memphis Grizzlies, because that is not true. If you were only here the last 2 years and you jumped on when Ja got drafted, maybe that's how you feel. But for those of us like Damichael that are from the city, or from people like me that have been covering this team for a decade, Dillon Brooks was there when they were in the, I can't say the word I really want to say, but when they were in the poop. He was there. And he has helped them get to this place. That doesn't change the fact that it's time to say goodbye, but it does mean that we shouldn't have so much vitriol like I've seen on Twitter and elsewhere today.
Yeah, very, very, very straight to the point there. At the end of the day, he is a culture shifter. That's what he could. That's why you've seen the rumors of teams like the Houston Rockets being interested in him.
He'd be great
because
in Houston.
He's that type of guy, right, Joe? What he did for the Grizzlies. You talk about this trash talk, this confidence, this swagger that this team plays. Sure, it's a lot of it's traced back to John Morant, but there's a big chunk of it with Dillon Brooks. And this team, the confidence, I mean, you see the confidence in the way he plays and in what he says. I mean, he's challenging LeBron James, Steph Curry, the list goes on. He's that type of guy. So he is a culture shifter. He's done his due in Memphis. But, as things go pretty much in life, there comes a time where we tend to outgrow things that we care about. And in the case of the Grizzlies, sure, you appreciate the 6 years that he's put in, but he is not a great fit for what they want to do going forward.
Dillon Brooks is what so many Grizzlies fans think Jay Crowder was. And I think that's the best way to put it. Everybody talks about this veteran presence, this experience, all those sorts of things. They didn't need Jay Crowder because they had Dillon Brooks. Go back and watch those games in the bubble. Watch John Morant look at Dillon Brooks, past Dillon Brooks. They already had that guy. And I will choose to move forward. And again, we'll see how it ends. Sign and trade, hopefully still. Fingers crossed, because that's the best use of Dillon. But even if he just walks, his time in Memphis was a good one, even though it's ending pretty poorly. We'll talk about injury updates, which we said we were going to do on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Coming up next year, we're going to lead off with some ones that are a little more long-term, potentially. Steven Adams, Brandon Clarke, those sorts of names. We'll lean on our wonderful beat writer from the Commercial Appeal, Damichael Cole, next on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by BetterHelp. Spending time on yourself in a given week can be challenging. You have so many different things going on, different family matters, different issues, different obligations. It can be difficult to find time for yourself, but we can feel stretched thin. We can feel like we're burned out, and therapy can be a great place for you to find the tools to get that balance in your life. If you're thinking of starting therapy, you should give BetterHelp a try. It is entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. You fill out a brief questionnaire, you get matched with a licensed therapist, or you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Find more balance with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. We will talk injury updates for Steven Adams and Brandon Clarke next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am one of your hosts, Joe Mullinax, now fully calmed down after my Dillon Brooks outburst. I apologize again for that. I think some of you sickos, or everydayers, as we like to call them, I think some of you like to see me get a little fired up. Joined by Damichael Cole with the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. He is the Grizzlies beat writer for that publication. I am a Grizzlies columnist for Bluff City Media, and I also write for SB Nation. I've been following the Grizzlies for a decade. Damichael and I have you covered, and we hope you'll continue to stick with us as the offseason grinds forth here on Locked On Grizzlies. Damichael, people have been asking about injury updates. A lot of it came out of the media availabilities. So much of our shows this week are connected to that end-of-season media from this past Sunday. What are some things you can tell our listeners? Let's start with the big Kiwi, because he's the one that, Brandon Clarke's important. I feel like a lot of folks were frustrated by what happened with Adams. It seemed like he was going to come back, and then he didn't. And, with Anthony Davis dominating the way that he did in that series, it would have been nice to have the big Kiwi there, Steven Adams, New Zealand, helping out on the floor.
Yeah, won't bury the lead here with Steven Adams. I think there's still some concern there. And when I say concern, mild concern, because at the end of the day, right now, the Grizzlies are not considering surgery. I think that's the most important thing to take from this. And I'll go back to that later on to why I think that's important. So non-surgical procedure here, but still, as of today, there is still no firm timeline on when Steven Adams could get back, to the point where Zach Kleiman, the Grizzlies general manager, president of basketball operations, basically said that the Grizzlies are expecting Steven Adams to be back at the beginning of next season. Mm-hmm. Not in the middle of June, not for preseason camp or anything like that. Beginning of next season is the hope, and that is the hope. That is a target. That is not a firm deadline that they're not putting on this. They're not putting one on this.
Right.
And kind of going more to that. What they've done lately is they're still talking to a bunch of different doctors, their opinions. People have been asking me, what is really going on with his knee? You see him walking around and fine and all that. He doesn't have much problem doing those things. The problem is, from what I've heard, there's swelling. You know, when he does those ramp up workouts and things like that, it swells up. And, you know, once that happens, there is the potential for very long-term damage. And someone asked me not too long ago about, well, since we still don't have an update, you know, up to this point, is there something career-threatening here? And again, I would say that is not the case right now, simply because the Grizzlies are operating from a non-surgical perspective. If he has to get surgery at some point and you're still delaying the potential return, think Alonzo Ball, who is on his, second or third surgery at this point on his knee. Once you get to that point, now it's like, oh, I don't know if he'll ever replay basketball again. But Steven Adams, all signs point to right now that there's going to be healing, you know, without surgery.
And that makes that Xavier Tillman decision all the more easy, right? Maybe the Grizzlies extend him beyond the team option.
That's
a $1.9 million team option. I mean, even before that medical update, I think Tillman has proven he's worthy of $1.9 million.
Easy.
But now the question is, do you extend him beyond that? That'll be an interesting storyline that we can talk about on another episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Somebody who a little bit more positivity coming out of media availability was Brandon Clarke. I was pleasantly surprised to hear the Brandon Clarke update. And Clarke is somebody that obviously they're not going to rush back. Like Achilles tear, especially for someone of the skill set of Brandon Clarke. You come back too early from that, that's a guy that'll never play basketball again. But it sounded relatively positive, like Clarke is ahead of schedule.
Yeah, and that's the words. If anything, ahead of schedule. That's exactly what Zach Kleiman said. And you think about his style of play. You know, this is a guy, he's a big-time leaper. You talk about how he gets to that patented floater shot. You talk about a rim runner who sets screens, gets downhill. He puts pressure on help defenders because either you're going to come help him on him as he's about to be that lob threat, or you're going to stay attached to that corner guy. So it's little things like that Brandon Clarke does that really helps this team. But you need that Achilles to be healed. So, again, not expecting him back at the beginning of the season or relatively early in the season period. This is going to be a process that you mentioned. The Grizzlies are very, very clear about their intentions on taking their time with these guys and with these injuries. So in Brandon Clarke's case, yes, ahead of schedule so far. I saw him not too long ago. He was walking with both shoes on, which is something we haven't seen much of. He pretty much has been in the boot, and I'm sure he's still going to be wearing the boot for the most part. But I saw him walking with two shoes on, and so he's doing better. And he's done the little things, you know, shooting free throws and doing I think some treadmill things I saw him doing one time. There is some progress there, and I think you can basically say, hey, latter part of the season, there's a chance that we can see Brandon Clarke. And I think that's big because you don't need him early in the regular season. I think you can still be a 50-plus win team, but getting Brandon Clarke back, you're probably going to need him in the postseason. We've seen in the past that Timberwolves series in the first round, he's capable of winning a series for you.
I'm going to do the dreaded mid-season acquisition line. I envision Brandon Clarke being somebody
there it is.
about the trade deadline of 2024. The Grizzlies.
The Danny Green.
He's going to be the Danny Green. He's going to be the one that we don't need to make a major trade because Brandon Clarke's going to be our mid-season acquisition. Although with Brandon Clarke, there's a better chance of it actually being true. Brandon Clarke is not as old as Danny Green. Brandon Clarke obviously is ahead of schedule, but again, they're going to be very cautious with that injury, especially because of his skill set. Brandon Clarke without a fully healthy and functioning Achilles is not as good of a basketball player. You can say that about anybody, but you think about, I'll just use Jamal Crawford off the top of my head. Like obviously he had some quickness to his game, but that dude just got buckets. He could find ways to get space. He wasn't an above the rim player. We've talked a lot about Zach Randolph on this episode. Same kind of concept. Brandon Clarke is that. So if he doesn't have that capacity to leap, get off the ground quickly multiple times, he's going to be in trouble. So it was good to get that positive update from Clarke, and hopefully season goes along. You know, we probably won't hear from Clarke or trade or signing, those sorts of things. Maybe that'll be our next chance in a couple of months for another update. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we are going to be talking about other injury concerns, one that's kind of flown under the radar because he played a lot, but that doesn't make him any less injured. And we'll also talk about Ja Morant's hand and some other bumps and bruises, perhaps, that are not as focused on as what happened with Adams and Clarke as the season concluded. You're listening and watching to Locked On Grizzlies. Stay with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your co-host, Joe Mullinax of Bluff City Media, Grizzlies columnist there, as well as SB Nation. Follow me on Twitter at Joe Mullinax. You can follow Damichael Cole, my wonderful co-host, at Damichael C, Grizzlies beat writer for the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis. He has great pieces on all the Dillon Brooks stuff going on. Continue to follow his tremendous work as the offseason grinds along, and follow us over at Bluff City Media as well. Damichael, some other injury tidbits from the final media availability for the 2022-2023 Memphis Grizzlies. Let's start with Desmond Bane here, because that's the one that I alluded to earlier in the show that we kind of forget about, because he played a lot, but he had a pretty substantial injury. And as he mentioned on the media availability, it's not like it's 100% by any stretch.
Yeah, and that's been the case for a while. Desmond Bane hasn't been 100% probably since October, early November. That stretch. And he averaged 21 points over 4.5 boards, 4.5 assists a game. So pretty good season on his part. Hey, Joe, if it's me, I'd use that in my contract details. Like, hey, look, man, if I'm averaging 21 on a bum foot, like, imagine what a healthy me could do. But that's neither here nor there. But at the end of the day, there is some mild concern, very mild in his case, not as much as Steven Adams, because right now the Grizzlies and Desmond Bane are still working through the process of determining if he needs a surgery on his toe at this point. So it's something that'll be figured out relatively soon here. And once we know more on that, that's when you'll have more on the potential timeline. It's not something at this point I'm expecting to carry over into the regular season, but we could have a Jaren situation similar here where he misses probably a few games to start the season. I don't think that'll be the case. But if they act swiftly here, but it's something they have to figure out. You know, does he need surgery or not? And right now, all signs are saying, hey, they're still working through that on his toe injury. Once that's decided, that'll kind of determine the direction for Desmond Bane. But I think that's pretty big because it is something that, depending on the option here and depending on when, it could potentially carry over possibly into early next season. I don't think it will by any stretch, but you have to keep open that possibility.
Well, he's about to sign a Jordan Poole, Tyler Hero-esque. You know, those two made $128 and $130 million respectively. No disrespect to those guys. Bane's probably going to make a little more than that. 4-year, $140 million extension. I think that's a realistic number. And you want to make sure that guy's ready to go. Because, again, as we've talked about and we'll continue to talk about, we are in a place now where you've got 3 dudes that are all making 9-figure deals over the life of a contract. It's time to be smart.
The championship window is here.
It's time to win. There is no more data accumulation. There is no more rebuilding. That's done. You know,
all those young guys.
Maybe it should have been done last year, but that's neither here nor there. It's definitely done now, and they have to make those moves before that Bane contract really kicks in, and we find out if Robert Parra, the owner of the Grizzlies, really is interested in paying that luxury tax. We'll have that answer sooner rather than later. Some other injury updates to Michael. Anything else coming out of media day that kind of jumped out at you?
Yeah, a few of them actually, and it's pretty much now we're centered around the guys who pretty much played. But just wanted to point these out because, again, these aren't excuses by any stretch of the imagination. It's just more the fact to point out that, hey, the Grizzlies had guys playing through certain injuries. Like last season, for example, we didn't learn that Dillon Brooks was playing through a bad hamstring until, March? I think he revealed that in March of this year, that he was playing in the postseason last season with a bad hamstring. But this year we kind of got more – detail on what these guys were playing to. Of course, everyone knows about the job. With Luke Kennard, I think it's fair to point out now that, we pretty much already knew that the shoulder injury wasn't serious, but the tidbit that I gained from him that stands out is if there was a Game 7, Luke Kennard wasn't going to play. He didn't straight up say that, but he said, hey, I would have gave it everything, tried my best, but even he knew it was unlikely. So it's just looking back on it, I think I was telling Joe, and Joe sent me a text message. He was like, I hope you're wrong. And
you weren't. You're right, unfortunately.
I know. I didn't want to, not from that perspective, but it's more of the fact that I wanted to use your example as I feel like that was the fan base. Everyone was very hopeful. Taylor Jenkins was hopeful. I sat down at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel with Taylor Jenkins, and he was very hopeful that Luke Kennard would be able to play. I even threw the possibility. I said, hey, if Luke doesn't play, what about these guys and all that? And he says, well, basically, if Luke doesn't play, he throws that out there first because they wanted him to play. But again, it was a lot of pain. You have to emphasize it was the shooting shoulder, and that was just too much. So even if it was a game 7, I know some people kind of keep themselves up at night. Those super fans say, oh, if we got it to game 7, we would have gotten Luke back. You wouldn't have. So a
little more peace at that. A little more peace.
Yeah. Have some peace in knowing that part of it. Then there's the other guys a little bit more under the radar. We talked about Ja there. We talked about Dez. The big men were also dealing with some little nicks and bruises there. Jaren Jackson, you may have noticed it at some point. He had the tape around his right hand. I know some people were pointing out the fact that, he had 31 points in game 1. What happened after that? This is, no excuse in any stretch of the imagination here on my part. At the end of the day, Jaren Jackson Jr. has to play much better. And he's very effective with his left hand, by the way, in the post. So, again, he still could have been much more productive, I think, but I'm not in his body. You're not in his body. We're not in his body. So he was dealing with a lot of pain in his right hand. I think the most notable moment just to the naked eye was when Anthony Davis threw down the dunk and Jaren Jackson Jr. fell on that hand. Looked like he was wrenching in pain there. That wasn't something that just happened on that play. That was a wrist that had been bothering him. I had seen him after several practices in California, icing the wrist and that whole thing. And then Xavier Tillman. Speaking of toes, he'd actually been battling a toe injury for a while. And I think it adds to your case here, Joe. You're talking about why you want to sign this guy, re-sign him. He's a tough dude. I saw X pretty much every time after we talked in the locker room. I don't want to put a timetable on it, but I'll say at least the last week. But based on what he said at media at the exit interviews, it was longer than that. But I asked him about it at the exit interviews because you'd always see him and he'd walk off real gingerly after the games. And to the naked eye, you probably think, oh, yeah, he just played 38 minutes. Tired dude. No, he was in some pain. And the fact that he responded that way, he rebounded the basketball and all that. And I think that's why Desmond Bane and Zach Kleiman and those type of people went out their way just to talk about what X brought to the table.
He was very impressive. And again, if we're talking $1.9 million, I think that's a no-brainer. The question is what that extension might look like. And we'll talk more about that on a future episode of Locked On Grizzlies. So much wonderful information on injuries. It does feel better knowing that Luke Kennard wouldn't have played in game 7, as weird as that sounds. You don't have to what might have been that situation. They were pretty beat up, but everybody's beat up, right? Folks will point out that LeBron and AD are not healthy. There's lots of different bumps and bruises after playing through an NBA season. So not an excuse. The Grizzlies have to get better. And it sounds like, starting with the Dillon Brooks situation, they're making steps and processes to try to do that, at least to the best of their ability through their perspective. So Damichael has tons of information like that continue to come out, not just here on Locked On Grizzlies, of course, but also with the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis. Make sure you're subscribing, following along with that wonderful publication, and follow Damichael's work on Twitter as well as at the Commercial Appeal. Thank you so much for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen today. Thank you to our everydayers, whether it's on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast, as proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network that make us come into your ears or come into your eyes or your mouth, wherever we're going, however we're helping you out. We are entering into your cerebellum and through your limbic system, and we are proud members of your everyday NBA content consumption. So thank you so much for that. We appreciate it here, Damichael and I, on Locked On Grizzlies. On our next episode of Locked On Grizzlies, we will take a closer look at some of what Kleiman the GM of the Grizzlies, Zach Kleiman, Taylor Jenkins, some more takeaways, more maybe specific to scheme that we'll take a look at and discuss. And I think that there's a lot that we can dive in there with Damichael.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about there. And Taylor Jenkins, I don't want to get into it too much. We know what the Grizzlies' identity is.
Mm-hmm.
And he has done a good job of forming an identity for this team, which I think is a big part of those things as a head coach. But there's a little bit more to it because, as we know, each season, that identity has to get tweaked a little bit, and you have to add more onto it. And that's kind of where we are with Taylor Jenkins right now.
Absolutely. No, I think that you're exactly right. And that's one of the things, with the roster, coaching philosophy also needs to tweak. And we'll talk about that on our Thursday edition of Locked On Grizzlies. So for Damichael Cole, I am Joe Mullinax. Again, thank you so much wherever you're checking us out on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. We appreciate you. We will see you next time. Until then, stay locked in. This is Locked On Grizzlies.